Melinda Harris has always been known for her toughness. She was a cop, not by chance or choice, but as if she was called to it. In a small town where everyone knew each other, she was something of a legend, a local heroine who wasn't afraid to go into the thick of danger for the sake of her job. Dark-skinned with short hair and sharp features, she embodied a strength and determination that drew respect and admiration, but behind this outward impenetrability was a deep-seated insecurity that she showed no one. Perhaps only Laura Farrell, her partner and close friend, was the person who knew Melinda best. Laura was Melinda's opposite. Her appearance spoke of gentleness, even though police work required her to wear a different mask, light skin, long hair that she always kept in a neat bun, and a kind but sometimes too trusting gaze. Laura was happily married to Dan Farrell, a local electrician, and nothing seemed to shake her confidence in the strength of their relationship. Laura and Melinda spent 5 years side by side, supporting each other in every situation. They had laughed, argued, covered for each other when work became unbearably difficult, and nothing seemed to break that bond. But everyone has their weaknesses. For Melinda, that weakness was Dan. She couldn't remember the exact moment when he stopped being just her friend's husband. Their communication had always been within the bounds of propriety. They met at parties organized by Laura, exchanged common courtesies, discussed the news. But something changed when one night he stayed late after the party, helping with the cleaning while Laura tucked the kids in. That was the beginning. The casual touch of his hand, the occasional smile, the innocent glances. What began as simple attention eventually grew into something more. Melinda tried to stop herself, each time reminding herself that it was just a fantasy, a dangerous game of fire. But with each encounter with Dan, her desire grew. That night, the first time they'd been alone together, the tension between them had felt almost physical. He stood so close she could hear him breathing. Their gazes crossed, and in that moment, everything changed. "You know this is wrong," she said quietly, trying to regain control of the situation. But Dan just stared at her in silence, and in his eyes, Melinda saw the same thing she was feeling, the pain of restrained emotion and a desire that was impossible to ignore. It was their first kiss, the moment they had both been waiting for, though neither of them wanted to admit it to themselves. After that, things began to escalate rapidly. Stolen minutes in the car, quick meetings in remote places where no one could see them. Each time, Melinda swore to herself that it was the last time, that she couldn't betray Laura, her best friend. But she was drawn to Dan like a magnet. At times, sitting across from Laura at her desk at work, she felt awful. Her gaze would wander, looking for signs that Laura suspected something. But she always looked serene, happy, as if she didn't notice the betrayal going on under her nose. Melinda struggled with herself, but each encounter with Dan only exacerbated her inner conflict. One evening, when Laura was late at work again, Melinda arrived at Dan's house. He met her at the door, agitated and nervous. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, but his look said otherwise. "I know," she whispered, feeling a wave of passion and fear wash over her. They spent several hours together that evening, and it was then that Melinda realized she had gone too far. Finding herself in his arms, she felt both pleasure and anxiety at the same time. She knew it could all end in disaster, but she couldn't stop. Meanwhile, shadows began to appear in Laura's life as well. She was staying late at work more and more often, having long conversations with Melinda about how her and Dan's relationship had changed. She began to notice his coldness, his sudden absences, though she didn't yet understand what was really going on. Melinda listened to these revelations with a stone face, hiding her own agony. "I think something's wrong," Laura said one day, sighing heavily as they patrolled the city streets together. "Dan has become different. It's like he's hiding something from me." Melinda gripped the steering wheel of the patrol car a little harder, trying not to give herself away. "You're just tired. Maybe you need some time for each other," she replied dryly, feeling her heart beating harder. Laura nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. She wasn't the naive woman many people thought she was. She sensed that something had changed, but she couldn't find an explanation for it. In the weeks that followed, their meetings with Dan became less frequent. He began to avoid Melinda, obviously feeling pressured by Laura. There were more and more questions in her eyes, and Dan was afraid the truth would come out. He didn't want to lose his family, especially his children, but every time he was alone with Melinda, his emotions took over. Melinda, for her part, began to notice that even her work was not as satisfying as it had been. Her thoughts kept returning to how long they could hide their affair. As soon as she saw Laura, she was overcome with guilt that ate away at her from the inside out. But every time Dan came into her life, everything went back to normal. They were both on a powder keg, and Melinda couldn't shake the feeling that the affair would end in disaster sooner or later. One evening, after a busy shift, Melinda sat in her car, phone in hand. Her fingers nervously touched the screen, but she couldn't decide to text Dan. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Was it all worth the risk? And most importantly, could she go on living with such a burden on her soul? But instead of sending the message, she put her phone back in her pocket. Her heart was racing with anxiety, but deep down, she knew it was too late to back out. The shadow of resentment that had been growing between Dan and Laura over the past weeks was becoming visible. Laura was asking questions more and more often, though not directly yet, and her gaze was more attentive than ever before. But neither Melinda nor Dan could imagine where their secret would lead. Melinda stood at the window, looking out at the street, but her thoughts were far from the scenery outside. She was thinking about him again, about Dan, about every encounter they'd had, about how it had all gone too far. Her heart was full of worry and doubt. She couldn't believe it had all happened to her, to them. It hadn't been a spontaneous infatuation. Their connection had been going on for months. But now, Melinda was thinking more and more about how they could have gotten here. Police work required discipline, strict adherence to rules, but Melinda's life had been in chaos of late. She could no longer look into Laura's eyes without feeling guilty. Every time they met at work, every word spoken in friendly conversation left behind bitterness and heaviness. Laura was her partner and friend, true, loyal, trusted her absolutely, and it was this trust that Melinda had betrayed most cruelly. Every time she and Dan were alone together, she thought the end was about to come. They would be exposed, and the consequences would be devastating. But at the same time, when she looked into his eyes, everything inside of her was drawn to him. She couldn't stop herself, even though she knew full well that one day it would all come crashing down. Their meetings with Dan always took place in secret. Usually they crossed paths on neutral territory, in a remote cafe on the outskirts of town, in a car in an old vacant lot, in secluded places where there were no people. They tried not to make eye contact, talking quietly, avoiding each other's gazes, as if they were afraid someone might notice them. But one day, something changed. It started with little things. They began to meet more often. They began to talk to each other more often about the future, not just the present. Dan kept saying that their connection couldn't last forever, that something had to change. He said that he couldn't live with Laura anymore, that their marriage had long since exhausted itself, and that was probably true. But that in no way justified what they were doing. Melinda knew that every time they met she was betraying her friend, and each time the feeling grew stronger. Dan was on edge too. He was starting to avoid talking about Laura, and if she did bring it up, he shut himself off. He was becoming irritable, irascible, and that only made Melinda more anxious. They were both like a powder keg. Meanwhile, strange things began to happen in the city. Small incidents, a robbery at a gas station, a theft at the supermarket, seemed normal for their neighborhood at first, but then things got more serious. Laura was the first to notice these coincidences. Her intuition, developed over years of work, told her that something was wrong. She began to connect these petty crimes to something bigger, as if there was more going on in the city than just domestic crime. "Don't you feel like things are getting tense around here?" Laura asked one day, sitting across from Melinda at her desk. "It's like everyone's going crazy. Petty crimes, strange disappearances. There's something in the air." Melinda nodded, trying to hide an inner shiver. Every word Laura said seemed to her to be another step toward uncovering their secret. Laura began to ask questions more and more often, to observe small details, and Melinda felt as if Laura was about to figure it all out. Soon, the paranoia began to overwhelm Melinda. She began to notice the way Laura stared at her while she worked, the way she asked questions that at first glance seemed normal, but between the lines read suspicion. "How are you doing? You've been too tired lately," she'd say, and Melinda flinched at each phrase. She knew it would happen sooner or later. Laura couldn't help but notice the change in her demeanor. They worked side by side, like sisters. Laura could sense even the slightest shift in Melinda's mood, and it was happening more and more often. Melinda could no longer be the person she used to be. She felt more and more like she was on the verge of opening up. One evening, after work, Melinda sat in her car contemplating another meeting with Dan. She decided that this should be their last meeting. Things had gone too far. They could no longer hide the truth. Her internal struggle had peaked. The guilt was growing by the day, and she couldn't live like this any longer. She wanted to end it, to tell Dan that they needed to separate so he could go back to his wife, to his family. But as soon as she dialed his number, his voice came over the speaker. Dan spoke quickly and excitedly. "Laura's missing." His voice was full of panic. "She's been gone for 24 hours and no one knows where she is." The words hit Melinda like a thunderclap. "What do you mean missing?" she asked, feeling her heart begin to pound in her chest. "She left for work yesterday and didn't come back. Her cell phone's been disconnected. I called all her acquaintances, co-workers. No one's seen her since this morning." Melinda swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Laura couldn't just disappear. It was impossible. Her partner, her best friend, it didn't make sense to her. "Did you call the police?" she asked, feeling the panic rising. "Not yet," Dan answered, his voice sounding unsure. "I didn't know if I should, if she was just staying with someone. But that doesn't sound like her, Melinda. I don't know what to think anymore." Melinda's insides tightened. On the one hand, she knew Dan was right. Laura would never do this if everything was okay. On the other hand, the panic that had been living in her mind for weeks was now breaking through. "I'll come over," Melinda said, trying to keep her composure. "We need to sort this out." When Melinda arrived at Laura and Dan's house, she felt like she had stepped into another world. Dan looked depressed. His usual confident expression had been replaced by despair. He sat on the edge of the couch, clutching his cell phone in his hands, as if he expected Laura to call and it would all turn out to be a misunderstanding. Melinda couldn't take her eyes off this man with whom she'd shared her most intimate moments. Everything seemed somehow distant and unreal now. Their affair, their meetings, all of it faded into the background of what was happening. Laura was missing, and that changed everything. "Are you sure no one has seen her?" Melinda asked, feeling her voice trembling. "I've called the hospitals, the precincts." Dan started, but stopped talking as he looked at her. "I don't know what to do. Maybe she just decided to take a break. But Laura's not like that." Melinda realized that Laura would never just disappear. She knew her partner like she knew herself. If she disappeared, something serious had happened. Melinda struggled to keep her cool. She couldn't stop thinking that their connection with Dan might have something to do with this disappearance. Every word Dan said now seemed strange to her. Every move he made seemed suspicious. Melinda suddenly realized that she didn't know this man the way she thought she did. It had been several days since Laura had disappeared, and every moment without news of her was becoming unbearable for Melinda. She tried to keep her composure, but something inside her was restless. This feeling of uneasiness grew every day, like a worm eating her from the inside. Everything in her life was upside down. Personal feelings for Dan, remorse, and worst of all, Laura's disappearance. She knew she couldn't afford to let herself panic. All her efforts were focused on keeping control of the situation, but every minute of uncertainty seemed to bring them closer to disaster. Every ring, every knock on the door made Melinda flinch. She lived on edge, expecting the worst. Dan called her every day, and each time his voice sounded more and more anxious. He tried to hold on, but Melinda could feel his fear. He was afraid of the truth, and so was Melinda. Search parties were organized on the third day after Laura's disappearance. Police officers, local volunteers, even those who usually stayed away from such matters took part. Melinda was among them, but she felt like a stranger. Her heart clenched at the thought that Laura might be found dead. The guilt she'd felt about her and Dan's affair was now mixed with paranoia. Laura might have suspected something and deliberately left to check on Melinda and Dan. It was a thought that made Melinda feel sick to her stomach. They searched every possible place: parks, woods, abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. But each time, the searches were inconclusive, and that only added to the anxiety of everyone involved. No one could explain where Laura could have gone. Everyone knew her as a responsible person who would never disappear for no reason. On the 5th day of Laura's disappearance, something happened that turned everything upside down. They found her. It was an abandoned warehouse in an industrial neighborhood, far from main streets and crowded places. A group of volunteers, following police instructions, were the first to arrive on the scene. One of them came across the back door of the building, which was partially ajar. No one expected to find something horrible there. Melinda arrived on the scene a few minutes after the call came in. The dark sky and the bleak, cold wind only added to her tension. She saw co-workers already gathered around the building, heard curt phrases and whispers. She moved closer, but was stopped by Sergeant Bradley, an older and experienced officer who was known for his fearless endurance. But on his face she noticed fear, something Bradley didn't know how to hide. "You don't want to see this," he said quietly but firmly. His gaze was fixed on the entrance to the building. Melinda felt her body goosebumps, but she knew she had to go on. She must see it with her own eyes, no matter how terrible the truth turned out to be. The inside of the building was semi-dark. The windows were covered with a thick layer of dust, through which rays of light barely shone. The policemen who were there were talking muffledly, and someone was taking pictures of the scene. Melinda felt the tense atmosphere as if the air had grown thicker. Laura was lying on the floor. Her body was mangled beyond recognition. Blood, dried and blackened, covered her clothes and skin. Her insides were twisted outward. It was a scene reminiscent of a brutal murder. Laura had been killed with such brutality that it could not have been a random act of violence. Something inside Melinda shivered. She stood staring at the sight, unable to believe it was her partner. The woman she had shared years of service with was now lying in front of her in a pool of her own blood. Melinda couldn't breathe. She could feel her legs shaking. For a moment she wanted to run away, just disappear, as if that would make things better. The investigation began immediately. The crime scene was cordoned off. Forensic experts began their work. The detectives who were called to the scene immediately realized that this case was not going to be simple. Among them was Detective Jeremy Smith, one of the most experienced and reliable specialists in the department. He had dealt with cases like this before, and he knew that the case would require the utmost concentration and tact. Melinda remained where she was, feeling panic overwhelm her. She was now more than just a witness or a co-worker. She was in the midst of events that threatened to destroy her life. Her inner world was crumbling. Laura's murder was the catalyst that all secrets could be revealed. She feared that Dan might somehow have been involved, that their relationship would become known to all. But she knew one thing. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't just walk away from this case. She was now part of the investigation. Detective Smith began interviewing everyone connected to Laura, starting with her closest friends and family. Melinda knew her turn would soon come as well. Her hands trembled as she sat in the police station waiting to be called. She realized she couldn't show how involved she was in Laura and her family's life. She had to be extremely careful not to give away her feelings for Dan. When she was finally called in for questioning, Detective Smith met her with a look full of attention and focus. He was a man who didn't miss a detail, and Melinda knew it. "Melinda, tell me everything you know about Laura's last days," he began calmly, but his voice was full of intense anticipation. She told everything she knew. How excited Laura had been about the recent crimes in town, how they had patrolled the streets together, discussed personal matters. She was careful not to mention anything about Dan, about his strange behavior in the last few days, about his panic, which now seemed suspicious. She spoke calmly, though everything inside her clenched with dread. The detective listened to her attentively, without interrupting. At one point he asked, "Have you noticed anything strange in Laura's behavior? Maybe she was seeing someone? Was she under duress?" Melinda froze, trying to hide her inner struggle. She knew she had to be careful, or her words might be misinterpreted. She shook her head negatively, trying not to give herself away. "No, It was nothing like that. Laura was always focused on her work. If there was something, she would have told me, she replied, feeling every word weighing heavily on her shoulders. As time went on, the investigation didn't move as quickly as they would have liked. Despite the detectives' best efforts, there were few clues. The cause of Laura's death was obvious: multiple stab wounds inflicted with rage. But who would do such a thing? Who had motives for such a brutal crime? Melinda was under pressure from two sides. On the one hand, she had to keep her cool and continue working with her colleagues without showing how deeply involved she was in the case. On the other hand, she couldn't get rid of the thought that her affair with Dan had something to do with what had happened with Laura. The questions she had avoided asking herself all this time now caught up with renewed vigor. After Melinda and Dan's affair had come to light, the situation around them had changed dramatically. The evidence in Laura's case was scant, but the detectives knew that cases like this often required patience and thoroughness. And now the entire department knew that her closest friend and partner had a secret relationship with her husband. This revelation instantly turned Melinda and Dan into prime suspects. Melinda was under intense scrutiny. Her coworkers no longer looked at her with the same respect. She felt the stares, mistrustful, full of suspicion, and sometimes outright dislike. Every move she made was monitored, every word was recorded, and it seemed to her that her entire entourage was waiting for her slightest mistake. Detective Jeremy Smith began his interrogations with renewed vigor, starting with Dan. He arrived at the station in a smart suit, but he looked haggard. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his eyes were inflamed, the marks of sleepless nights and the fear that had haunted him. Smith spent several hours with him, asking questions that gradually became more and more pointed. Dan, you knew your affair would come out sooner or later, didn't you? Jeremy Smith looked directly into the eyes of the man who sat across from him, trying to catch any emotional reaction. Yeah, but it has nothing to do with what happened to Laura. Dan's voice was shaking, but he tried to hold it together. We tried to stop it, but... Stop it? The detective interrupted him. Did this happen before or after she disappeared? Dan hesitated, and for a moment it was clear he was losing control of the situation. After... We talked about it a few days before Laura disappeared. Melinda wanted it to stop. She couldn't live like this anymore. But he swallowed nervously. It had nothing to do with the murder. I would never hurt Laura. Jeremy Smith nodded, but his gaze remained cold-blooded. Never? What if Laura had found out? If she had found out about your affair? How do you think she would have reacted? Dan didn't know what to say. He stared at the table, avoiding a direct answer. The question was painful, because he knew what a terrible blow it would have been for Laura. And though he avoided admitting it to himself, he realized that their life couldn't be the same anymore. Laura would find out everything, sooner or later. I loved her, he muttered. Yes, I was wrong. I betrayed her, but I would never kill her. After questioning Dan, Jeremy Smith called Melinda in. Her heart was pounding so loud it seemed everyone in the room could hear it. She sat at the same desk where Dan had sat hours before her, but she didn't see anything reassuring in his gaze as he left the interrogation room. Smith started with simple questions about her relationship with Laura, how they worked together, what she knew about her partner's last days. Melinda kept her cool, though her inner tension was growing by the minute. She realized that her words could be used against her and tried to answer carefully. Melinda, let's move on to more personal matters, the detective finally said, squinting slightly. Have you talked to Dan about ending your relationship? Yes, I did, Melinda nodded, feeling her words take her back to the painful moments when she'd been trying to end it all. I couldn't take it anymore. It was a mistake, and I knew it would only ruin everything. Ruin it? Smith interjected, his voice harder. What if Laura already suspected something? What if she was going to expose you? The words sliced painfully at her nerves. Melinda felt the tension inside her reach a peak. I don't know what she knew or suspected. Her voice shook, and she couldn't control it anymore. We never talked about it. I tried to keep our relationship as coworkers. I loved her as a friend, as a partner. Smith frowned but didn't say anything back. He just watched her reaction, as if trying to pull what she was hiding out of her eyes. She realized, however, that she couldn't afford to give away her true feelings. She knew that Laura might have been aware of their affair, but she couldn't let that be used against her. Every day the investigation grew more convoluted. New clues were emerging, but they didn't help answer the main question: who killed Laura? There were whispers among colleagues that Melinda and Dan might have planned the murder to get rid of Laura, and these rumors only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. But Detective Smith wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. He knew that often the most obvious suspects turned out to be innocent, and this case required deeper analysis. One of the oddities that began to surface concerned the last weeks of Laura's life. It appeared that she herself might have had secrets. Her co-workers recalled that she had become more secretive and nervous. Her behavior indicated that she was going through something no one knew about. But no one could say what it was. Could it have had something to do with her relationship with Dan and Melinda? Or was something else weighing on her? Every day, new little details emerged that only added to the confusion. One of her old friends told detectives that a few days before her disappearance, Laura had started receiving strange messages on her phone. Anonymous, but clearly threatening. However, the police couldn't find these messages. Her phone was missing, and that added another element of mystery. Smith ordered a thorough background check on anyone who might have had a motive for Laura's murder. Dan was under suspicion, Melinda too, but soon other people were on the horizon. It could have been her friends or co-workers who were jealous or envious of her success, or one of her exes, whom Laura hardly ever talked about. Smith knew the killer could have been anyone, but the fact that Melinda and Dan were so closely associated with the victim made them prime suspects. Meanwhile, Melinda was feeling more and more pressure from all sides. She couldn't escape the feeling that someone was manipulating events. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind it all, and that someone knew her weaknesses. Her affair with Dan had become the perfect trap, and she couldn't understand who could have set it up so precisely. Her paranoia was growing by the day, and now she didn't know who she could trust. "Maybe it's one of your co-workers," Dan had once told her when they'd met in secret. "Someone who knows more about us than we realize. Someone who hated Laura, or both of us." "But who?" Melinda whispered, feeling the terror rising inside her. Who would have a motive? Who would kill her so brutally? Dan didn't know the answer. All their conversations now were filled with fear and doubt. Neither of them could trust each other completely anymore. And now the only thing left for Melinda to do was to find out the truth before it was too late. It had been weeks since Laura's murder, but the tension around Melinda and Dan continued to build. All eyes were on them. The Illinois State Police Department no longer trusted Melinda, despite her years of sterling service. Dan found himself in an even more desperate position. His career was ruined, his reputation destroyed, and the suspicion of his wife's murder was turning his life into a nightmare. Melinda, feeling alone and cornered, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind it all. She kept coming back to thoughts of the days when she and Laura had worked together as best partners, and how things had slowly started to fall apart. Her affair with Dan had been a mistake, she'd admit, but Melinda knew one thing. She wasn't a killer. She couldn't do that to Laura. Detective Jeremy Smith continued to work the case. He had managed to gather enough facts, but they didn't fit together. Everything pointed to Melinda and Dan. The motivation was obvious: an affair, jealousy, fear of exposure. But inside, Smith felt it was all too obvious. Experience told him that a killer is rarely the one the evidence immediately points to. He began checking out everyone who was close to Laura. One person stood out among them: Chris, an old friend of hers who worked in the department. He was a reserved but loyal friend of Laura's. For a long time, Chris had remained in the shadows, but now Jeremy had turned his attention to him. Smith invited Chris in for a conversation. Unlike the other suspects, he didn't seem nervous or confused. His answers were clear and restrained, and he confidently denied any involvement in Laura's murder. "Laura and I were just friends," Chris said, crossing his arms over his chest. "She told me a lot about her life, about Dan, about her work. We supported each other." "What about Melinda?" Smith asked, watching his companion closely for a reaction. "Melinda?" Chris raised his eyebrows. "We didn't talk much. I wasn't as close to her as I was to Laura." "Were you aware of her affair with Dan?" The detective deliberately paused, watching Chris's expression change slightly, though he tried to keep his cool. Chris looked away and shrugged uncertainly. Laura suspected something, but she didn't say anything to me directly. I think she wanted to find out for herself. Are you sure she didn't discuss it with you? After all, you were close, Smith continued to press. No, nothing specific, Chris answered quickly, nervously twiddling his thumbs. She was just saying that there was something in her life that she couldn't deal with. Smith didn't like these answers. Something wasn't right. He knew Chris might know more than he was saying, so the detective decided to step up his surveillance on him while he continued to check the other details. Melinda was distraught. After yet another interrogation, her paranoia was getting worse. It seemed to her that not only was the killer manipulating events, but he continued to follow her. Every moment of her life was under scrutiny, and she could no longer trust anyone, not even herself. She thought back to Chris, Laura's strange and silent friend, whom she had always called her protector. Could he be involved? That evening, when Melinda was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, she got a call from Dan. "You have to be careful," he said, his voice full of panic. "I think someone is following me. I can't live in such fear anymore." "Who?" Melinda tried to understand what was going on. "Do you think it's who killed Laura?" "I don't know," Dan said with desperation. "But we're both in danger." Melinda suddenly realized that the only way to protect herself and Dan was to find out the truth. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. A few days later, the investigation took a new turn. Smith managed to get CCTV footage from the area where Laura's body was found, and it shocked him. On the night of the murder, Chris was spotted on the footage. He was in the vicinity of the abandoned building where, it later emerged, Laura had been lured to on the night of her murder. Detectives called Chris for another interview, but this time he did not come. He disappeared, and this was the first evidence of his involvement. Smith immediately organized a search. A few days later, Chris was found in his apartment. He was clearly on the verge of a breakdown. A search revealed many strange notes that showed his obsession with Laura. He was jealous of her and Dan, convinced she deserved better, and saw himself as her true protector. "She shouldn't have been with him," Chris shouted when the detectives finally arrested him. "She could have been happy, but they ruined everything. They killed her from the inside out, and I just put her out of her misery." When Melinda was informed that the killer had been uncovered, she couldn't believe it. Chris, the same man who had always been there for Laura, had turned out to be her executioner. He manipulated their lives, used their mistakes and secrets to create the perfect trap. His jealousy mixed with his mania for control led to tragedy. Melinda felt the weight of guilt heaped on her shoulders. She realized that her affair with Dan had been the catalyst for this whole situation. If she hadn't gone along with her feelings, if she had broken off the relationship sooner, maybe Laura would still be alive. But now it was too late. Laura was dead, her life was ruined, and Melinda had to live with that burden. Soon, Laura's case was officially closed. Chris was convicted of murder. However, even after the crime was solved, the repercussions of the horrific incident continued to affect the lives of everyone involved. Melinda left the police force, her career ruined and unable to recover from the tragedy. Dan, who had also lost everything, left town hoping to start a new life, but knew the past would always haunt him. This case was a stark reminder of how mistakes, passions, and betrayals can lead to irreparable consequences when there are demons lurking around you, ready to destroy everything for the sake of their illusions. When it was over, Melinda was alone in her empty house, surrounded by a silence that nothing could break. The memories of Laura, her smile, her dedication and friendship were forever in her heart. Laura was someone who had always believed in honesty, in loyalty, in the power of human connection. But that strength was fragile, shattered by a fleeting passion that broke all seemingly unbreakable bonds. Melinda reflected on how one mistake could destroy a life. Her connection with Dan had begun with attraction, secret and exciting, but its price had proved prohibitive. They betrayed Laura not only in life, but also after her death, for it was their actions, their seemingly innocent passion, that led to disaster. Loyalty is not just a commitment to be honest with another person. It is an inner responsibility to yourself and those you love. Melinda realized that Laura's loyalty to their friendship, her devotion, was unshakable. But she, Melinda, had been broken by weakness when she had allowed herself to give in to her desires without thinking of the consequences. And what was the price? A friendship that seemed unbreakable was destroyed. Melinda realized that friendship, like loyalty, requires honesty and trust. She and Laura had been through a lot, and if she'd been able to tell Laura the truth from the beginning, maybe they could have made it through. But hidden secrets have ruined everything. Chris, obsessed with Laura and his desire to protect her, became an example of how wanting to protect someone can lead to irreversible consequences. His jealousy and unrequited love made him a killer. In his desire to spare Laura pain, he himself became the source of her end. This case was an ominous reminder of how easily good intentions can turn into destructive forces. Life is made up of many moments of choice. Sometimes one wrong move can set off a chain of events that can't be stopped. Melinda will never be able to get Laura back again, never be able to undo the mistakes she's made. But she will always remember that true loyalty is more than the absence of betrayal. It's a constant battle against your own desires for the sake of those you love. A feeling like passion can be powerful and blinding, but a passing infatuation will never replace what has been built over years. True intimacy is about openness, trust, sincerity. And if you destroy those foundations, no amount of passion can fill the void that will be left. Now, sitting alone, Melinda knew that trust and loyalty were the most precious gifts you could offer another person. And one day, when she faced a new choice, she would remember how thin the line between a moment of pleasure and an eternity of pain.